Arizona Territory, summer of 1878. The merciless sun blazed overhead, beating down on Hannah Foster's raw, sunburnt shoulders as she led her 5 children through the unforgiving desert. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, their faces drawn, tight with hunger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had been counting the minutes between Peter's desperate cries for water, and the silence from her youngest now scared her more than his tears. The 5-year-old hung limply in Samuel's arms, his small body too exhausted to even protest anymore. "Just a little further," Hannah whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. The mountains shimmered in the distance like a mirage, promising shelter but never seeming to draw any closer. Clara stumbled beside her, the 10-year-old's hand clutching desperately at her mother's tattered skirt. Behind them, the twins Abigail and Andrew supported each other, their matching faces ghostly pale beneath layers of dust and sunburn. Hannah's canteen had been empty since dawn. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth, her thoughts growing foggy with each passing hour, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant death, not just for her, but for all 5 of her children. And after everything they'd survived, she refused to let the desert claim them. 3 days earlier, they'd been traveling with the Henderson Wagon train, 24 people in 8 wagons, heading west toward California. Hannah's husband, Jacob, had died of typhoid 6 months before in St. Louis, but she had been determined to continue their journey, to build the life they had dreamed of together. Now that dream felt like madness. The attack had come at dawn, while most of the camp still slept. The first gunshot had torn Hannah from her dreams, and she'd emerged from their wagon to find chaos. Men on horseback swarmed through the camp, firing indiscriminately. The Hendersons were already dead, their bodies crumpled beside their morning fire. "Mama!" Samuel had appeared at her side, his young face rigid with terror. "What do we do?" There had been no time to think. Hannah had gathered her children and fled into the rocks, while bullets whistled past them. Behind them, the screams had gradually faded to an awful silence, broken only by men's voices calling to each other as they looted the wagons. They had hidden in a narrow crevice between 2 boulders, pressed together so tightly that Hannah could feel each of her children's racing heartbeats against her skin. They had stayed there for hours, long after the bandits had ridden away with everything the wagon train had possessed, everything Hannah and her children would have needed to survive. When they finally emerged, the sight had nearly driven Hannah to her knees. Bodies lay scattered around the smoldering remains of the wagons. No one had been spared, not even little Alice Cooper, who'd been only 3 years old. The bandits had taken all the food, all the water, all the horses. They had left nothing but death behind them. Samuel, at 12, the oldest, and trying so hard to be the man his father would have wanted, had searched desperately through the wreckage for anything useful, while Hannah had kept the younger children from seeing the worst of it. He had managed to find a single canteen that had been overlooked, a box of matches, and a small hunting knife. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. "Which way, Mama?" Samuel had asked, his voice cracking with strain. Hannah had no answer. East led back to settlements, but it was at least a week's journey on foot, and they had no supplies. West led deeper, into territory she had heard the other wagons describe as Indian country. Neither choice promised survival, but standing still promised death with certainty. West, she had decided finally. The map showed mountains. If we can reach them, there might be water. Now, 3 days later, Hannah questioned that choice with every painful step. The mountains were closer, yes, but still so far. Samuel had stopped asking if they were going to make it. The twins no longer bickered as they always had. Clara's songs had fallen silent on the first day. And Peter. Hannah glanced back at her youngest. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Even at 12, Samuel struggled to carry his brother's weight in this heat. None of them would last another day without water. The ground suddenly shifted beneath Hannah's feet. She stumbled, nearly falling to her knees before catching herself. For a moment, she thought the dizziness had finally overtaken her completely, but then she realized they had reached the foothills. The flat desert was giving way to rockier terrain. The mountains were no longer a distant mirage. "Look," she whispered, her voice a harsh rasp. "We're getting closer." Clara nodded weakly. The twins didn't respond at all. Hannah forced herself forward, scanning the hillside desperately for any sign of water, any splash of green that might indicate a spring. The landscape remained stubbornly barren, all dust and rock and the occasional twisted mesquite. But as they climbed higher, Hannah noticed something. Shadows among the rocks that seemed deeper than they should be. Caves, perhaps. At least they might offer shelter from the relentless sun. "There," she said, pointing. "We'll rest there." Samuel nodded grimly, shifting Peter's weight in his arms. The boy hadn't spoken in hours. The cave entrance was small, barely visible until they were right upon it. Hannah bent down, peering into the darkness. Cool air brushed against her face. Not fresh exactly, but a blessed relief from the baking heat outside. She stepped inside, then froze. The cave wasn't empty. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she made out the figures deeper in the cave. 3 people, no, 4, sitting around the remains of a small fire. Indigenous people, their dark eyes, now fixed intently on Hannah and her children. Instinctively, Hannah backed away, pushing Clara behind her. Every story she'd ever heard about savage Indians flooded her mind. She had no weapon, no strength left to run. But as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she realized that one of the figures was a child, perhaps Clara's age. A family, then. And on the stone floor beside them sat several clay pots and what looked like a bundle of plants. For a long moment, nobody moved. Hannah's heart hammered in her chest. She had led her children right into more danger. She should turn, run, find another place to hide. Peter moaned softly in Samuel's arms, the sound echoing in the stillness of the cave. The indigenous woman rose in one fluid motion and approached them. Hannah tensed, ready to shield her children with her body if necessary. But the woman's eyes weren't hostile. They were evaluating, taking in the state of Hannah and her children. With a quick, practiced gaze, she spoke, not to Hannah but to the older man behind her. Hannah couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. These strangers were dying. The man nodded once and gestured toward the back of the cave. The woman turned back to Hannah and pointed to Peter. "Water," she said in accented English. "Child needs water." Hannah's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." The woman gestured for them to come deeper into the cave. Hannah hesitated only briefly before following. At this point, they had nothing left to lose. The cave opened up into a larger chamber where the air was noticeably cooler. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the center, a tiny spring bubbled up from the rock, filling a small natural basin before disappearing back into the ground. It wasn't much, but to Hannah, it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. The woman, Kiona, they would later learn, guided Samuel to lower Peter near the water. She dipped a wooden cup into the basin and brought it to the boy's lips, supporting his head as she helped him drink in small sips. "Slow," she cautioned when Clara and the twins rushed forward. "Too much, too fast. Bad." Hannah watched as the Apache family helped her children drink, making sure they took only small amounts at first. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Peter's eyes fluttered open. The twins' faces regained a hint of color. Clara actually managed a weak smile. Hannah sank down on the cave floor, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, now that immediate. Death no longer seemed certain. As darkness claimed her, her last thought was that they might survive after all. When Hannah awoke, the quality of light had changed. How long had she slept? Hours at least, possibly longer. She sat up quickly, looking around for her children. They were all there, looking better than they had in days. Peter was awake, sitting with the young Apache girl who was showing him how to weave something out of yucca fibers. Clara and the twins were watching the older man, tattered, as he crushed something in a stone mortar. Samuel sat near the cave, entrance with the Apache man, Naheli, seemingly deep in conversation despite the language barrier. "You awake?" Kiona approached, offering Hannah a cup of water and what looked like a flat cake made of unfamiliar seeds. "Eat, slowly." Hannah accepted both gratefully. The cake was bitter but filling, and it settled in her empty stomach without protest. As she ate, she studied the family that had saved them. They were Apache, she realized now. The woman's calm, competence, the man's careful watchfulness, the simple but effective tools arranged around their living space. All spoke of people deeply in tune with this harsh environment. This wasn't a temporary shelter. It was a home of sorts. "Thank you," Hannah said when she had finished eating. "You saved our lives." Kiona nodded. "Children should not die in desert." Her English was limited but clear enough. She gestured towards Samuel and Naheli. "Your boy, smart, learns quick." Hannah looked over to see Naheli demonstrating something to Samuel. How to hold a curved piece of wood that Hannah realized was a hunting bow. Samuel was watching with intense concentration, his face more animated than she had seen it since his father died. "Your family?" Hannah hesitated, unsure how to ask. "Do you live here?" Kiona shook her head. "Summer camp. Move soon." She looked at Hannah's children, her expression softening slightly. When strong enough. The meaning was clear. They wouldn't leave Hannah and her children until they could survive on their own. Over the next days, Hannah discovered what true survival looked like. The Apache family didn't simply give them food and water. They taught them how to find both in a landscape that had seemed barren to Hannah's inexperienced eyes. Naheli took Samuel and sometimes Clara on short excursions, showing them how to identify plants that held moisture, how to track the subtle signs of animals in the desert. Kiona taught Hannah which desert plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which were poisonous. She showed her how to prepare prickly pear fruit without getting pricked by the tiny spines, how to roast agave hearts in a pit oven, how to find and dig for edible roots. The twins learned quickly how to snare rabbits under Takoda's patient. Guidance, while Peter became a pony's constant shadow, soaking up knowledge about desert life through their play. A pony showed him how to move silently, how to listen to the desert, how to recognize the warning sounds of rattlesnakes before coming upon them. At night, they would gather around the small fire near the cave entrance. Despite the language barrier, Hannah began to understand pieces of their story. Takoda was Naheli's father. They had separated from their larger band for the summer hunting, as was sometimes their custom. They knew about the massacre, had seen the smoke from the burning wagons, but had wisely stayed away until they were certain the attackers had gone. "Bad men," Naheli had said, his face grim. "Not first time." Hannah had nodded, understanding more than he said. These bandits likely attacked any vulnerable travelers, indigenous or white. Violence made no distinctions. On the fifth day, Samuel returned from hunting with Naheli, his face flushed with pride. He carried a desert hare, small but fat, that he had killed with the bow Naheli had made for him. "I did it, Mama," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I can help feed us now." Hannah embraced him, tears stinging her eyes. Her son was growing up too fast, forced into manhood by circumstances beyond his control. But at least he was growing up. At least he would live. That evening, as they roasted Samuel's hair along with tubers that Hannah and Clara had gathered under Kiona's guidance, Hannah realized something had shifted within her. The paralyzing fear that had been her constant companion since the attack had receded. In its place was something sturdier, not confidence exactly, but a growing belief that they might actually find a way forward. She watched her children, noting how their sunburns had faded to tans, how their movements had become more assured, how they had begun to carry themselves with a subtle new awareness of their surroundings. They were changing, adapting. The desert was harsh, but it was teaching them strength. As the days passed, Hannah found herself drawn to watch Nahele. There was something about his quiet competence, the careful way he moved through the world, that reminded her of Jacob. Not in appearance or manner, they could not have been more different, but in the steadiness he brought to his family's life, the calm authority with which he taught Samuel, the gentle patience he showed with Peter. She caught herself staring once and quickly looked away, heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. What was she thinking? She was a widow with 5 children, stranded in the wilderness with no prospects, and he was an Apache man, with his own family, his own ways, worlds apart from hers. Yet when their eyes met across the fire that night, something passed between them, a simple acknowledgement of shared purpose. They were both protecting their families, both teaching their children to survive, both finding a way through grief, though Hannah didn't yet understand the source of his. The next morning, Nahele approached Hannah as she was teaching the twins how to grind mesquite beans into flour using techniques Kiona had shown her. "Come," he said simply, "show you something." Hannah hesitated, glancing at her children. "They safe," Nahele assured her. "Kiona watch." Curious, Hannah followed him out of the cave and up a narrow path that wound higher into the mountains. The climb was steep, but Hannah found it easier than she would have just a week ago. Her body was growing stronger, more accustomed to this landscape. They reached a rocky outcropping that overlooked the vast desert below. Hannah caught her breath. At the view, from here she could see for miles the distant shimmer of what might be a river, the rolling foothills, and far beyond, the faint outlines of mountains on the horizon. Nahele pointed west. "California," he said. "Many days walking. Very hard." He turned, pointing southeast. "Tucson, settlers there." Then he pointed northeast. "Prescott, white man's town." Hannah stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. He was showing her their options, the possible paths forward. "Which way?" she asked softly. Nahele was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice even. "Prescott closest. 7 days, maybe 8. Tucson longer, but more friendly to woman alone." He looked at her directly. "California?" He shook his head slightly. "Not now. Wait for more wagons, maybe." Hannah nodded, taking in the landscape spread before them. A week ago, the thought of traveling anywhere through this desert would have filled her with terror. Now, she found herself calculating, planning, thinking of what they would need. They still wouldn't have an easy journey, but thanks to what? They had learned. They had a chance. "Why are you helping us?" The question had been building in Hannah for days, and now it spilled out. "You could have left us to die." Nahele's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. "I had wife before Kiona," he said after a pause. 3 children. Soldiers came. Very bad time." He stopped, and Hannah understood. He wouldn't or couldn't say more about what had happened. After a moment he continued. "Takoda found me, alone, dying. He could leave me." He shrugged slightly, but he did not. Hannah swallowed hard, hearing all he wasn't saying. He had lost a family, just as she had lost Jacob. He had been saved by kindness, and now he was passing that forward. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Nahele nodded once, acknowledging her words. Then he turned back toward the path. "Come." Children, waiting. They descended in silence, but it was a comfortable one. Something had shifted between them. Not romance, not in these circumstances, but a deeper understanding. They were two parents who had faced unbearable loss, finding ways to continue for the sake of their children. That evening, Hannah sat with her children, explaining what Nahele had shown her. "We have choices," she told them. "We can try to reach Prescott or Tucson." "What about California?" Clara asked. "That's where Pa wanted to go." Hannah stroked her daughter's hair. "That dream isn't gone," she said gently. "But right now, we need to be practical. California is too far without proper supplies." Samuel nodded, his expression serious. "Nahele says Prescott has a fort, army protection, but it's smaller." "And Tucson?" Hannah asked. "Bigger, more people, more chances to find work." Samuel hesitated. "But it's farther, and we'd have to cross Apache land. Nahele says most would leave us alone if we travel peaceful, but..." Hannah understood. There were no guarantees in this wilderness. "What do you think, Mama?" Samuel asked. Hannah looked at each of her children in turn. A week ago, she would have chosen based on fear alone, whichever path seemed least dangerous. But now, she found herself thinking beyond mere survival. What kind of life could they build? Where would they have the best chance not just to live, but to thrive? "Tucson," she said finally. "It's where we'll have the best chance of making a real home." The decision made, preparations began in earnest. Kiona showed Hannah how to make carrying pouches from rabbit skin, how to prepare pemmican that would sustain them on their journey, how to weave sandals from yucca fibers that would protect their feet better than their worn-out shoes. Nahele worked with Samuel, improving his skill with the bow, teaching him to move quietly, to read the landscape for danger and opportunity. Even Takoda, who rarely spoke, contributed by carving a walking stick for Hannah and smaller ones for Clara and the twins. On the morning of their 10th day in the cave, Hannah knew it was time. Their supplies were as ready as they would ever be. The weather was favorable, with clouds promising slightly cooler temperatures. Delaying further would only make it harder to leave. As they gathered their modest possessions, Hannah was struck by how little they had, and yet how much richer. They were in knowledge and confidence than when they had arrived. She looked at her children, hardly recognizing them as the same frightened, exhausted souls who had stumbled into the cave on the edge of death. Samuel stood tall, a small bow and quiver slung across his back, his face serious but no longer terrified. Clara had woven her hair into tight braids like a pony's, practical for desert travel. The twins moved with new assurance, and even little Peter had a steady determination in his step. Kiona approached Hannah with a final gift, a small bundle of medicinal plants wrapped in a square of cloth. "For fever," she explained, pointing to different leaves and roots. "For snake, for stomach pain." Hannah accepted it gratefully, tucking it carefully into her carrying pouch. "Thank you," she said, the words woefully inadequate for all they had done. "For everything." Kiona simply nodded, her expression unchanged but her eyes warm. Nahele stepped forward, handing Samuel a small flint knife. "Remember," he said, "listen to desert. Desert speaks. You listen, you live." Samuel nodded solemnly, tucking the knife into his belt. "I'll remember." The final goodbyes were brief. The Apache were not given to emotional displays, and Hannah found herself adopting their restraint. There was a simple dignity in it, an acknowledgement that life continued, that paths diverged, that strength lay in looking forward rather than back. As they prepared to leave, a pony darted forward suddenly, pressing something into Peter's hand. Hannah glimpsed a small carved animal. A rabbit, she thought. before Peter closed his fingers around it, his face breaking into a rare smile. They set off as the sun was rising when the air was still cool. Nahela had drawn a map in the dirt, marking key landmarks, water sources, places to avoid. Hannah had memorized it as best she could. Samuel, she knew, had done the same. From the cave entrance, the Apache family watched them go. No waving, no calls of farewell, just a steady presence seeing them off on their journey. Hannah glanced back just once and saw Nahela raise his hand in a brief gesture. Not goodbye, but safe passage. She turned back to the path ahead, adjusting the straps of her carrying pouch. Around her, her children moved with purpose, already scanning the terrain as they had been taught, already part of this landscape in a way they hadn't been before. The desert stretched before them, vast and challenging. But Hannah no longer saw, only its dangers. Now she recognized its hidden gifts as well. The plants that offered food and medicine, the subtle signs of water, the rocks that provided shelter from sun and wind. She understood now that survival wasn't just about enduring the land, but becoming part of it. "Ready?" she asked her children. Samuel nodded. Clara reached for Hannah's hand, squeezing it once before letting go. The twins exchanged determined looks. Peter clutched his wooden rabbit, his small face set in concentration. Together, they stepped forward into their new life, carrying with them not just the survival skills they had learned, but something more precious, the knowledge that kindness could be found in the most unexpected places, that bridges could be built across the deepest divides, and that even in the harshest wilderness, humanity's capacity for compassion could flourish. Behind them, the cave that had been their salvation grew smaller in the distance. But its lessons would remain with them forever, guiding them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Hannah woke to the unfamiliar sensation of coolness against her skin. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. Where was the burning sun, the endless horizon of sand and rock? She blinked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The events of the previous day rushed back with startling clarity. The cave, the Apache family, water, blessed water. She pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. The chamber they occupied extended deeper into the mountain than she had initially realized. Natural shelves of rock lined the walls, holding clay pots and woven baskets. A small fire burned near the center, carefully positioned beneath a narrow fissure in the ceiling that drew the smoke upward. The air smelled of herbs and roasting. Roots, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Her children slept nearby, their bodies arranged in a protective circle. Samuel's arm was thrown across Peter's small chest, while Clara and the twins were curled together like kittens. Their faces, though still gaunt, had lost the terrifying pallor of impending death. Hannah's throat tightened with emotion. Just hours ago, she had been certain she would watch them die one by one in the merciless desert. "You wake early." The voice startled her. Hannah turned to find Kiona sitting cross-legged by the fire, grinding something in a stone mortar. The Apache woman didn't look up from her task, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Yes," Hannah responded, unsure what else to say. She cleared her throat, which still felt raw despite the water they had given her. "Thank you for saving us." Kiona's hands paused briefly. She glanced up, her dark eyes meeting Hannah's. "Children should not die in desert," she repeated, as if this explained everything. Perhaps to her it did. Movement from the cave entrance drew Hannah's attention. Nahela entered, carrying a bundle of what looked like cactus pads. His moccasins made almost no sound against the stone floor, a stark contrast to the heavy boots the men of Hannah's wagon train had worn. He nodded once in her direction, his expression unreadable, before placing his burden beside Kiona. "Sleeping. Still," he observed, glancing at Hannah's children. "They need rest," Kiona replied, setting aside her mortar to examine the cactus pads. Many days without food, without water. Hannah felt a sharp pang of guilt. She should have been better, prepared, should have secured more supplies before they fled the massacre, should have found water sooner. Her children had nearly died because of her ignorance. As if reading her thoughts, Nahele turned to her. "Desert kills many who do not know its ways," he said simply. "Even my people, when young, must learn." Hannah swallowed hard, forcing back tears. She would not break down in front of these strangers who had shown her family such unexpected mercy. "Will you teach us how to survive here?" Something flickered in Nahele's eyes. Approval, perhaps. He exchanged a glance with Kiona before nodding. "Yes. First you eat, then learn." The smell of cooking eventually roused the children. Samuel was the first to sit up, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. His eyes darted around the cave, confusion giving way to remembrance as he took in their surroundings. When he spotted Hannah sitting near the fire, his shoulders sagged with relief. "Mama," he whispered, crawling to her side. "Are we safe?" Hannah pulled him close, pressing her lips to the top of his head. "Yes," she murmured, "for now." One by one, the others woke. Clara, always quick to adapt, seemed fascinated by Kiona's work with the cactus pads. The twins clung to each other, their usual chatter subdued by the unfamiliar surroundings. Peter remained curled against Samuel until the scent of food finally lured him to awareness. "Hungry," he mumbled, his small face pinched with the discomfort of an empty stomach. Kiona approached with a wooden bowl containing what looked like slices of roasted cactus and some type of seed cake. She crouched before Peter, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Eat slow," she instructed, demonstrating by taking a small piece of the cactus and chewing it thoroughly. "Stomach small now. Too much makes sick." Peter stared at her warily, then at the food. His hunger won out over caution. He reached for the cactus, mimicking Kiona's careful approach. His eyes widened at the first taste, not with disgust, but surprise. "Sweet," he said, looking to Hannah for confirmation that this strange food was safe. "Yes, good," Hannah encouraged. "Eat slowly," like she said. Kiona distributed similar portions to each of them, ensuring that Hannah and the older children understood the importance of moderation after their days of starvation. The food was unlike anything Hannah had tasted before. The cactus slightly slimy but pleasantly sweet, the seed cakes nutty and substantial. More importantly, it settled in their empty stomachs without protest. As they ate, Hannah became aware of another presence in the cave. An elderly man sat so still in the shadows that she hadn't noticed him until now. His wrinkled face was impassive, but his eyes, sharp and alert, missed nothing as they tracked the movements of these strangers in his domain. "Takoda," Nahele said, following Hannah's gaze. "My father." Hannah nodded respectfully toward the old man, who acknowledged her with the slightest inclination of his head. After they had eaten, Kiona brought water again, this time in small clay cups, one for each of them. "Drink slow," she reminded them. "Body forget water. Must remember." The day passed in a haze of rest and small meals. By evening, Hannah could see color returning to her children's faces. Clara had begun to watch Kiona with open curiosity, while the twins ventured occasional whispered conversations. Samuel remained vigilant, his young shoulders carrying the weight of responsibility too heavy for his years. Only Peter seemed to adjust quickly, his resilience a product of his age. As night fell, the temperature in the cave dropped significantly. Nahele built up the fire, while Kiona produced woven blankets from one of the storage alcoves. Hannah hadn't seen such blankets before. The patterns were intricate, the colors derived from natural dyes she couldn't identify. Keona showed them how to wrap themselves efficiently, conserving body heat while leaving their arms free if needed. That night, as her children slept soundly for the first time in days, Hannah remained awake, her mind racing. What would happen next? These people had saved them, fed them, sheltered them, but they couldn't stay here indefinitely. The journey to California still stretched before them, impossible now without supplies or protection. "You think loud," Naheli's voice came, quietly from across the fire. He sat cross-legged, his back straight, looking not at Hannah but into the flames. Hannah hesitated, unsure how to respond to his uncanny perception. "I'm wondering what comes next," she admitted finally. "We have nowhere to go, nothing to trade, no way to repay your kindness." Naheli's expression didn't change. "Repayment. Not needed. Desert law. Help those in need when you can. Tomorrow may be you who helps another." "But we have lost everything," Hannah persisted. "Our wagon, our supplies, our future in California." Naheli turned his gaze to her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Lost things can be found again. Different things, maybe. But found." Hannah wanted to believe him, but the weight of their circumstances pressed upon her. 5 children, depending on her, hundreds of miles from any settlement, in a land she didn't understand. "Sleep now," Naheli advised, his tone gentler than she had heard it before. "Tomorrow learning begins." The next morning dawned clear and already hot. Hannah and the children emerged from the deeper chamber to find Naheli waiting near the cave entrance. He carried several wooden implements that Hannah didn't recognize, as well as a bow and quiver of arrows. "Today, water," he announced. "First lesson of desert." Samuel stepped forward eagerly. "Are we going to find a river?" A hint of amusement flickered across Naheli's face. "No rivers here, but water hides in many places. Desert holds secrets. You must learn to see." They followed him out of the cave and down a narrow path that wound through the rocky terrain. Hannah kept Peter close, while the twins and Clara stayed between her and Samuel. The sun, though still relatively low in the sky, already beat down mercilessly. Hannah felt her skin tightening, preparing to burn again despite the days in the desert that had already darkened her complexion. Naheli stopped suddenly, crouching down beside what looked to Hannah like just another patch of dirt and rock. "Look," he instructed, pointing to a small, inconspicuous plant with grayish leaves. "This one holds water." He used one of the wooden tools, a kind of digging stick with a flattened end, to carefully excavate around the plant's base, revealing a surprisingly large tuberous root. With practiced precision, he extracted it without damaging the upper growth, then sliced it open with a stone knife. Inside, the flesh was moist and pale. "Taste," he offered, handing a piece to Samuel. Samuel hesitated only briefly before accepting. His eyes widened as he chewed. "It's wet," he exclaimed, "and kind of sweet." One by one, they each tried a piece. The root didn't provide enough moisture to quench thirst completely, but in a landscape where every drop was precious, Hannah immediately understood its value. "Plant stays alive," Naheli explained, pointing to how he had left the upper portion intact. "Next season grows again. Take all. Nothing returns." Throughout the morning, he showed them other plants that stored water. Barrel cactus whose pulp could be chewed for moisture. Certain types of agave whose bases collected dew. Even a vine that, when cut, yielded a few precious drops of liquid. Each time, he demonstrated how to harvest without destroying, how to leave enough for the plant to regenerate, how to recognize which specimens were mature enough to use and which should be left to grow. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. Naheli led them back toward the cave, but stopped at a large rock formation Hannah hadn't noticed before. He pointed to a natural depression in the stone where a small pool of water had formed. Rain catchment, he explained. Stone holds water sometimes for many days. Look for these when you travel. Clara, who had been unusually quiet during their expedition, suddenly spoke up. But this water is dirty, she observed, noting the debris floating on the surface. Nahele nodded approvingly at her observation. Yes, must filter. He removed a small pouch from his belt and extracted what looked like charcoal and sand. He demonstrated how to layer these materials in a cone made from yucca fibers, then slowly poured the stagnant water through this makeshift filter into his water skin. The liquid that emerged was remarkably clearer. Still boil when possible, he advised, but better than dying of thirst. As they made their way back to the cave, Hannah found herself looking at the landscape with new eyes. What had seemed barren and hostile now revealed itself as a complex environment filled with hidden resources, if one knew where to look. At the cave, Kiona waited with the younger children and Takoda. She had prepared another meal, this time featuring what looked like strips of dried meat alongside the now familiar seed cakes and cactus. Rabbit, she explained as she distributed the food. Takoda and a pony caught yesterday. The meat, though tough and gamey, was the most substantial nourishment they had received since the massacre. Hannah watched as her children ate with growing strength, their movements becoming more purposeful, their eyes more alert. Even Peter managed to chew the leathery strips, his small teeth working determinedly at the unfamiliar texture. After they had eaten, Kiona beckoned to Hannah. Come, women's work now. Hannah followed her to another section of the cave where several plant bundles had been laid out on a woven mat. Kiona sat cross-legged beside them and gestured for Hannah to join her. These heal, Kiona explained, pointing to the various plants. This for burn. She held up a thick, succulent leaf that Hannah recognized as aloe. This for stomach pain. A bundle of dried flowers. This stops bleeding, a moss-like growth. One by one, she identified each plant and its purpose, demonstrating how to prepare it, which parts to use, how to crush or steep or apply them. Hannah tried to commit everything to memory, acutely aware that such knowledge might mean the difference between life and death for her children. She had known some basic herbal remedies back east, arnica for bruises, willow bark for pain, but those plants didn't grow here. This was an entirely new pharmacopoeia to learn. When Kiona finished her explanations, she handed Hannah a small clay pot and gestured toward her sunburned skin. For now. Later, make hat like mine. Sun enemy in desert. Hannah scooped some of the greenish paste from the pot and cautiously applied it to her arms. The relief was immediate, a cooling sensation that soothed the angry heat of her burned skin. She murmured her thanks, feeling a new respect for this woman whose knowledge was so perfectly adapted to the harsh environment. Meanwhile, Nahele had taken Samuel aside and was showing him how to use the bow, a smaller version that seemed sized for a boy his age. Hannah watched as her son struggled with the unfamiliar weapon, his frustration evident as arrows flew wide of the simple target Nahele had set up. He learns, Kiona observed, following Hannah's gaze. Boy must hunt soon, feed family. The phrase struck Hannah like a physical blow. Samuel was 12, still a child in her eyes, but approaching an age where boys in this land became providers. Jacob had intended to teach him farming in California, not hunting in a desert wilderness. Yet here they were, and Samuel would need these skills if they were to survive. Will we stay here? Hannah asked, the question that had been gnawing at her finally finding voice. With your family. Kiona's expression remained neutral. For now, yes, until stronger, until learning enough. She glanced at Hannah, her dark eyes assessing. Then you choose. Choose what? Hannah wondered. To continue to California somehow? To seek out white settlements? To remain with these people whose ways were so different from her own? The options seemed simultaneously too limited and too vast. As if sensing her turmoil, Kiona added, "Not decide today. Today, learn to live." That evening, as they gathered around the fire, Hannah noticed a subtle shift in their dynamics. The rigid separation between the two families had begun to soften. Clara sat beside a pony, watching intently as the Apache girl demonstrated a cat's cradle game with a length of sinew. The twins had overcome their initial wariness of Takoda and now sat at his feet, mesmerized as the old man carved something from a piece of wood with his knife. Peter had fallen asleep against Hannah's side, his small body finally relaxed in true rest rather than exhaustion. Nahele entered the firelit circle, returning from some errand outside. He carried several rabbits tied to his belt, evidence of a successful hunt. Hannah watched as he methodically began to prepare them, his movements efficient and respectful of the animals that would provide their food. There was a dignity in his work that reminded her unexpectedly of Jacob. Though her husband had planted fields rather than hunted game, he too had approached his labor with quiet reverence. "You have questions," Nahele observed without looking up from his task. "Ask." Hannah hesitated, aware that her children were listening. "Why did you help us?" she finally said. "Most white settlers say the Apache are." She trailed off, suddenly conscious of the offensiveness of repeating what she had heard. "Say, we are dangerous," Nahele finished for her, his tone matter-of-fact rather than angry. "Sometimes true, sometimes not, like all people." He set aside one prepared rabbit and reached for another. "Your children were dying. No one deserves to die like that." "But others of your tribe might not have helped us," Hannah persisted. Nahele considered this. "True. Some would not." He glanced at Takoda. "My father taught differently. Said hate makes more hate. Kindness sometimes makes kindness. Sometimes," Takoda spoke, his voice surprisingly strong for his age. "Not always, but worth trying." Hannah absorbed this, struck by the wisdom in his words. Among the settlers, she had heard only fear and prejudice when it came to the indigenous people of these territories. Yet here was a family who had saved her children without hesitation, who were now teaching them how to survive in this unforgiving land. The contradiction was jarring. "What happened to your wagon party?" Nahele asked, turning the conversation. Hannah told them about the massacre, the dawn attack, the merciless bandits, the desperate flight into the rocks with her children. As she spoke, she realized this was the first time she had articulated the full horror of that morning. Her voice faltered when she described finding little Alice Cooper's body, but she forced herself to continue. These people had earned her truth. "Bandits," Nahele said when she finished. "Not first time. They attack Apache too. Take horses, kill men, worse to women." His jaw tightened. "Army does nothing. Too few soldiers, too much land." "Do you think they'll come back?" Samuel asked, his voice small but determined. "The bandits?" Nahele shook his head. "Not soon. They take what they want, then go far away. Sell in Mexico maybe, or California." He looked at Samuel directly. "But you must learn to watch for danger, always." Samuel nodded solemnly. Hannah felt a surge of pride for her son, who was trying so hard to be brave despite his fear. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Mornings were devoted to learning survival skills, finding water, identifying edible plants, setting simple traps for small game. Nahele worked primarily with Samuel, while Kiona taught Hannah and Clara the women's knowledge of the Apache. Even the twins and Peter absorbed what they could, their young minds adaptable in ways Hannah sometimes envied. Gradually, their strength returned, The hollowness in their cheeks filled out as regular meals restored what starvation had taken. Their skin darkened under the desert sun, and their hands, once soft from settled life, developed calluses from new types of work. Hannah found muscles developing in her arms and legs from gathering firewood, carrying water, grinding seeds into flour. Samuel grew more proficient with the small bow Nahali had made for him, eventually managing to hit the target more often than not. On the 5th day, Nahali took Samuel on a proper hunt. They left before dawn and returned mid-afternoon with a young pronghorn antelope, Samuel's first significant kill. The pride on her son's face as he helped drag the animal into camp was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He was still a boy, but circumstances were forcing him to become a man far too quickly. That evening, they celebrated with a feast. Keona showed Hannah and Clara how to prepare every part of the animal. Not just the meat for eating, but the hide for containers, the sinew for thread, the bones for tools. Nothing was wasted. A stark contrast to the practices Hannah had known back east. As they ate, Hannah noticed Samuel speaking quietly with Nahali, their heads bent together in serious conversation. Later, when the meal was finished and the younger children had drifted to sleep, Samuel approached her. "Mama," he said, his voice pitched low. "Nahali says we need to decide soon." Hannah frowned. "Decide what?" Samuel glanced back at Nahali, who gave him an encouraging nod. Whether to go on to California or to find a settlement closer by or, he hesitated, or to stay with the Apache, at least for a while. Hannah felt a flutter of anxiety. She had been avoiding this very question, focusing instead on the immediate tasks of survival and recovery. "What did Nahali say we should do?" Samuel shook his head. "He didn't tell me what to choose. He said it's our decision." He paused, then added, "But he said each choice has dangers and benefits. We should know them before deciding." Hannah looked past Samuel to where Nahali sat, his expression unreadable in the firelight. She rose and went to join him, settling on the ground nearby. "Samuel says we must decide our path soon." Nahali nodded. "Moon is waning. Soon my family moves to winter grounds, higher in mountains where game is better." "And we can't come with you?" Hannah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Could," Nahali said after a moment's consideration, "but difficult. Other Apache there. Some do not welcome white faces." He looked at her directly. "Could be dangerous for children." Hannah swallowed hard. "What are our options then?" Nahali gestured westward. "California. Still far. Need supplies, weapons, horses. Dangerous. Journey even for prepared travelers." "We have nothing," Hannah acknowledged, the reality of their situation still painful to confront. "There is Fort McDowell," Nahali continued. "Army post 3 days' journey north. They take in survivors, sometimes." His tone suggested he didn't consider this the best option. "And our third choice?" "Prescott. Settlement 5 days east. Growing town. Work maybe for women with children." Nahali's eyes were steady on hers. "Some people their kind, some not." Hannah considered these options, each fraught with its own perils. Continuing to California seemed almost impossible in their current state. The army fort might offer immediate security, but what kind of life awaited them there? And Prescott, a frontier town where a widow with 5 children would be a burden, unless she could find work quickly. "What would you do?" she asked Nahali, not because she expected him to decide for her, but because she valued his judgment. He was silent for a long moment. "Cannot say," he finally answered. "Different paths for different people." He looked at her children, sleeping peacefully nearby. But children need stability, need time to grow strong. Hannah followed his gaze. Her children had already endured so much: the loss of their father, the uprooting of their lives, the horror of the massacre, the near death in the desert. How much more could they withstand? "I need time to think," she said at last, "to talk with Samuel and Clara." Nahele nodded. "Time you have, but not much." He rose fluidly to his feet. "Rest now. Tomorrow, more learning." That night, Hannah lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. The decision before her seemed impossible, each option a leap into the unknown. Yet she knew Nahele was right. They couldn't remain in this limbo forever. The world would keep moving, and they must move with it or be left behind. As the fire died down to embers, casting long shadows across the cave walls, Hannah found herself watching Nahele's family. Even in sleep, they maintained a certain alertness, an awareness of their surroundings that Hannah and her children were only beginning to develop. They had survived in this harsh land for generations, adapting and enduring while the white settlements spread ever westward. What would it be like, she wondered, to live as they did, to follow the seasons rather than putting down permanent roots, to read the land as easily as she had once read books? It was an alien concept, yet in the past days she had glimpsed its appeal, the freedom of it, the deep connection to the natural world. But it wasn't her world, and her children deserved a chance at the future Jacob had dreamed for them. Education, opportunity, stability. The question was how to get them there from here, with nothing but the knowledge they had gained and the strength they were rebuilding. Hannah closed her eyes, pushing aside the weight of decision for a few hours of much-needed rest. Tomorrow would bring another day of learning, another step toward whatever future awaited them. For now, that would have to be enough. The dawn brought with it a new tension in Hannah's shoulders, the weight of decision pressing down on her. With each passing hour, she slipped quietly from her sleeping place, careful not to wake the children. The cool morning air greeted her at the cave entrance, a brief respite before the day's inevitable heat. She stood there, watching the horizon lighten from deep purple to pale gold, and tried to quiet her racing thoughts. A soft footfall behind her announced Kiona's presence. The Apache woman came to stand beside her, silent for several moments, as they both gazed out at the awakening desert. "Your heart is troubled," Kiona said finally. It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded, not bothering to mask her concern. In the days they had spent together, she had come to appreciate Kiona's directness. "Nahele says we must decide our path soon, but each choice seems impossible." Kiona's expression remained impassive, but her eyes held understanding. "All paths have thorns," she agreed. "But standing still has most thorns of all." "My husband had a plan," Hannah said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "California, land of our own, a future for the children, now." She gestured helplessly. "Now I don't know what's best for them." Kiona considered this. "Children are stronger than you think," she said after a pause. "They bend like young trees in strong wind, not break." She turned to look directly at Hannah. "You also." Hannah wasn't so sure. The past week had shown her how ill-prepared she was for this harsh land, how much she still had to learn. The thought of facing it, alone, without the guidance of Nahele's family, filled her with dread. "Come," Kiona said, interrupting her thoughts. "Today I show you something important." They returned to the cave where the children were beginning to stir. After a simple breakfast of leftover antelope meat and pine nuts, Kiona gathered Hannah, Clara and the twins for what she called women's lessons. Samuel would continue his hunting practice with Nahele, while Peter remained with Takoda and Aponi, who had taken a special liking to the youngest foster child. Kiona led them to a rocky area, a short distance from the cave, where various plants grew in the shelter of large boulders. Some Hannah recognized from their previous excursions: the spiky yucca, the round barrel cactus, the gnarled mesquite. Others were new to her. Today, clothing, Kiona announced, pointing to a particularly robust yucca plant. From this, many things. She demonstrated how to harvest the long, sword-like leaves without damaging the plant's heart. Then, sitting cross-legged on a flat rock, she showed them how to scrape away the fleshy material to reveal the strong fibers within. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, separating the tough strands and rolling them against her thigh to create cordage. "Strong," she said, holding up a length of the finished twine for their inspection. For snares, for sewing, for baskets. Clara took to the work quickly, her small hands surprisingly adept at the unfamiliar task. The twins struggled more but persisted with determination that made Hannah's chest swell with pride. They had been city children back in St. Louis, more familiar with shops and schools than survival crafts, yet here they were, adapting, learning, growing stronger each day. As they worked, Kiona shared stories, not directly but in pieces, fragments, of her life that emerged naturally in the rhythm of their labor. She had been born during a great drought, she told them. Many of her people had died that year, but her mother had found water where others couldn't, saving their family. She had learned early the importance of listening to the land, of reading, the signs that meant the difference between life and death. "Your mother sounds very wise," Hannah commented, struggling to roll the yucca fibers evenly between her palm and thigh. Kiona nodded. "She was. Died when soldiers came to our village. I was younger than your Clara." Hannah's hands stilled. "I'm sorry," she said softly, aware of the inadequacy of the words. Kiona shrugged slightly. "Long ago now. But her knowledge," she tapped her temple, "stays here. I remember." Hannah thought of her own mother, gone for over a decade now. What knowledge had she passed on? Bread recipes, embroidery stitches, the careful social niceties of their Boston community. Useful, in that world perhaps, but of little help in this one. "I have nothing to give my children that will help them here," she admitted, the realization painful. Kiona's gaze was steady. "You learn. You teach them what you learn. This is Mother's job." The simple wisdom of it struck Hannah deeply. She had been so focused on what they had lost, on her own inadequacies, that she had failed to recognize their capacity for growth. They were not the same people who had stumbled into the cave on the verge of death. They were changing, adapting, gaining strength and knowledge with each passing day. After they had created a substantial pile of yucca cordage, Kiona showed them how to weave it into a simple sandal. The twins, initially skeptical of footwear made from plants, became enthusiastic when they tried on the finished products and found them surprisingly comfortable. "Better than shoes for dessert," Kiona explained. "Feel ground beneath feet, know what comes." They spent the remainder of the morning working on footwear for everyone, Clara picking up the weaving pattern so quickly that she was soon helping Hannah with the more complicated areas. By midday, they each had a serviceable pair of yucca sandals to replace their worn-out shoes. As they made their way back to the cave for the noon meal, Hannah noticed Clara walking differently. More carefully, her gaze now directed at the ground before her feet, rather than aimlessly scanning the horizon. The yucca sandals were teaching her to pay attention to where she stepped, to be mindful of the terrain in a way her leather shoes never had. Another lesson of the desert, Hannah thought. Everything here had purpose. Everything taught something if you were willing to learn. At the cave, they found Samuel cleaning his arrows under Nahali's guidance. The boy's face was flushed with pride, and Hannah realized he must have had some success in the morning's hunt. Sure enough, 2 desert hares lay nearby, already skinned, and ready for the cooking fire. "Look, Mama," Samuel called when he saw them. "I got both of them myself." Hannah went to him, genuinely impressed. "That's wonderful," she said, examining the small game. "That will make a fine meal. Nahali says I'm learning fast." Samuel added, his voice lowered as if sharing a secret. "He says I have good eyes for tracking." Hannah glanced at Nahali, who nodded confirmation. Boy has talent, he said simply. Listens well, watches. Samuel beamed under the praise, standing a little taller. Hannah felt a complicated mix of emotions. Pride in her son's accomplishments, sadness that he was learning to hunt rather than to farm as his father had intended, gratitude to Nahele for his patient teaching, and an underlying anxiety about the decisions that still awaited them. The afternoon brought new lessons. Kiona showed Hannah and Clara how to prepare the hare skins, scraping away the flesh, stretching them on frames made of bent twigs, rubbing them with a mixture of animal, brains and fat to soften the leather. It was messy, unfamiliar work, but Hannah found herself enjoying the physicality of it, the simple focus required. For water bags, Kiona explained, for moccasins when winter comes. Many uses. Winter, Hannah repeated, the word a stark reminder of time passing. How cold does it get here? In mountains, very cold. Snow sometimes. In lower desert, cold at night only. Kiona glanced at her. You think of winter journey. Hannah nodded reluctantly. If we go to Prescott, we might need to travel in colder weather. Kiona's expression remained neutral, but Hannah sensed her concern. Not good to travel in winter without proper clothing, proper shelter. Need better preparation. It was yet another complication in the already difficult decision before them. Stay too long, and winter would make travel more dangerous. Leave too soon, and they might not be sufficiently prepared for the journey. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, Hannah observed her children with new eyes. Samuel sat beside Nahele, listening intently as the Apache man explained something about the bow he was crafting. Clara had positioned herself near Kiona, watching the woman's nimble fingers work a piece of deerskin. The twins were engaged in some sort of counting game with a pony, using small stones as markers. And Peter, quiet, reserved Peter, who had barely spoken since the massacre, was curled up against Takoda's side, listening to the old man's low, rumbling voice as he told what seemed to be a story. They had found places here, each of them. Tenuous connections, perhaps, but real nonetheless. Hannah wondered what would happen when those connections were severed, as they inevitably must be. As if sensing her thoughts, Nahele looked up from his work. Tomorrow, he said, I show oldest boy hunting trail. Good for him to see more territory. I'd like to come, Hannah said impulsively, if that's possible. Nahele considered this, then nodded. Good. Mother should know where son travels. The next morning, Hannah woke before dawn, anticipation and anxiety mingling in her stomach. She had left Clara in charge of the younger children, with Kiona promising to keep an eye on them. Samuel was practically vibrating with excitement. As they set out, the small bow Nahele had made for him slung across his back. They traveled swiftly, following game trails that Hannah would never have noticed without Nahele's guidance. He moved with remarkable silence, his moccasins seeming to find every stable, quiet spot among the rocks and gravel. Samuel copied his movements, growing more adept with each mile. Hannah did her best to follow their example, but she knew her steps were still too heavy, too careless. After about an hour's journey, they crested a rise, and the landscape opened before them. From this vantage point, Hannah could see for miles. The rippling mountains to the north, the vast stretch of desert to the south and east. And there, just visible on the horizon, what appeared to be a smudge of green. River, Nahele confirmed, following her gaze. 3 days that way. Not safe journey without horses. Bandits watch river crossings. Hannah nodded, absorbing this information. Another route closed to them, at least for now. Nahele pointed north. Mountains there, our winter camp. Then east. Prescott that direction. 5, maybe 6 days walking with children. And fort? McDowell? Hannah asked. North and east, Nahele replied, through difficult country, hidden soldiers. Hannah frowned. Hidden soldiers. Army scouts, Naheli clarified, his expression darkening slightly. Watch Apache movements, not always friendly, even to white travelers. Another complication. Hannah sighed, looking out across the vast landscape. From up here, the enormity of their situation was impossible to ignore. They were tiny figures in an immense wilderness, their survival balanced on a knife's edge of knowledge and luck. Come, Naheli said, breaking into her thoughts. Hunting now. Boy must learn. They spent the morning tracking a small herd of pronghorn antelope. Samuel watched everything Naheli did with intense concentration. How he read the subtle signs in the dirt, how he tested the wind direction, how he chose their path to remain downwind of the animals. Hannah found herself equally fascinated, recognizing that these skills might well determine whether her children ate or starved in the weeks to come. When they finally spotted the herd grazing in a small valley, Naheli held them back, studying the animals carefully before selecting their target, an older female who had separated slightly from the group. Not best meat, he explained in a whisper, but easiest shot for Boy's first big hunt. Others too fast, too watchful. Samuel nodded solemnly, his young face set with determination. Hannah felt her chest tighten with a mixture of pride and apprehension. This was so far from the life they had planned. Her 12-year-old son hunting wild game with a handmade bow under the tutelage of an Apache warrior. Yet there was something right about it too. Something that resonated with a deeper, more primal part of her. They crept closer, using the sparse vegetation for cover. When they were within range, Naheli signaled for Samuel to ready his bow. Hannah held her breath as her son nocked an arrow, drew back the string with trembling arms, and aimed at the grazing antelope. The first shot missed, flying over the animal's back and startling the herd into motion. But Samuel, with Naheli's steady encouragement, quickly nocked another arrow. This time his aim was true. The arrow struck the antelope in the flank, not a killing shot, but enough to slow it as the herd bounded away. Now, Naheli said, rising swiftly, we follow blood trail. They tracked the wounded animal for nearly an hour, Samuel learning to read the signs of its passing, drops of blood on rocks, disturbed earth, broken twigs. When they finally found it collapsed in the shade of a large boulder, Naheli showed Samuel how to approach safely, how to deliver the killing stroke with his knife, and how to thank the animal's spirit for the gift of its life. Hannah watched from a slight distance, giving them space for this solemn moment. There was something deeply moving about the respect Naheli showed for the fallen animal. The careful way he helped Samuel understand that taking a life, even for food, was never to be done carelessly or without gratitude. When it was over, Naheli taught Samuel how to field dress the antelope, preserving as much of the meat as they could carry and caching the rest in a high crevice where scavengers would be unlikely to find it immediately. We return for more tomorrow, he explained, nothing wasted. It was mid-afternoon by the time they began the journey back to the cave, each of them burdened with a share of the meat. Hannah could see the fatigue in Samuel's posture, but also the unmistakable pride. He had provided for his family today. He had taken a significant step toward manhood. You did well, she told him softly as they walked. Your father would be proud. Samuel's eyes glistened briefly before he blinked back the emotion. Do you think so? Pa was going to teach me to farm in California. He wanted to teach you to care for your family, Hannah corrected gently. That's what you're learning now. The how of it doesn't matter so much as the why. Samuel considered this, then nodded, seeming to find comfort in the thought. Ahead of them, Naheli maintained a steady pace, occasionally stopping to point out features of the landscape or signs of animal activity. Hannah realized he was continuing the lessons even as they traveled, embedding the knowledge so deeply that it would become instinct. When they returned to the cave, the other children rushed to greet them, exclaiming over Samuel's success. Clara had spent the day learning to process mesquite beans into flour with Kiona, while the twins proudly displayed the small baskets they had woven under Apache's guidance. Even Peter had news. He had helped Dakota collect medicinal plants and could now identify 3 that helped with stomach ailments. That night, they feasted on the antelope meat, roasted over the fire with wild herbs that Kiona had gathered. The meat was lean and gamey, but to Hannah it tasted like victory, proof that they could survive here if they had to, that they were no longer completely helpless in this harsh environment. As the meal concluded, Nahele cleared his throat. "Time grows short," he said, his gaze moving from Hannah to each of her children in turn. 3 days more, then my family must travel to winter grounds." The statement hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Hannah glanced at her children, seeing the anxiety return to their faces. Whatever comfort and security they had found here would soon end. Decisions could no longer be postponed. "We need to talk," she said to her children once Nahele's family had moved to the other side of the cave to give them privacy. "About what comes next?" Samuel nodded soberly. Clara drew the twins closer, as if preparing them for bad news. Peter simply watched her with solemn eyes, too young to fully understand, but sensing the importance of the moment. "Nahele has shown me the routes we might take," Hannah began. "We could try to reach Prescott. It's about a week's journey from here. There's work in towns like that, maybe a place for us to stay until we decide what to do next." "What about California?" Clara asked. "That's where Pa wanted us to go." Hannah shook her head gently. "California's still too far, sweetheart. We don't have the supplies or protection for such a long journey right now." "Could we stay with Nahele's family?" one of the twins, Andrew, suggested. "I like it here." "They're going to their winter camp in the mountains," Hannah explained. "Nahele says it might not be safe for us there. Other Apache might not welcome white faces." "What about the fort?" Samuel asked. "Fort McDowell." Nahele mentioned it. Hannah hesitated. "That's another possibility. The army might help us, but Nahele seemed to think the journey there would be difficult and—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain the complicated politics of army posts in Apache territory to her young children. "You don't want to go there," Samuel finished for her, his perception surprising her. "You think it's not right to seek help from soldiers when the Apaches saved us." Hannah met her son's gaze, seeing understanding beyond his years. "It's not just that," she said carefully. "The Army's relationship with the Apache is difficult. I'm not sure we'd be welcome there either, after accepting help from Nahele's family." Clara's brow furrowed. "So Prescott is our only choice?" "It seems the most practical option," Hannah admitted. "At least for now. We could find work, save money, perhaps join another wagon train to California in the spring if that's still what we want." "Will Nahele's family come with us to Prescott?" Peter asked, his small voice piping up unexpectedly. "To show us the way?" Hannah's heart ached at the hope in his question. "I don't think so, sweetheart. They have their own journey to make." Peter's face fell. He pulled the small wooden animal Dakota had carved for him from his pocket, clutching it tightly. "I don't want to leave them," he whispered. None of them did, Hannah realized. In just a week, these strangers had become something like family to them, teachers, protectors, friends. The thought of continuing without their guidance was terrifying. "We've learned so much," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Nahele has taught Samuel to hunt. Kiona has shown us which plants are safe to eat and how to find water. We're stronger now than when we came here." Samuel straightened his shoulders. "I can help provide for us, Mama. I've been practicing every day. And I've learned about the healing plants," Clara added. I can find the ones that help with pain and fever. We know how to make baskets now, Abigail chimed in. And we're getting better at it. And I can spot rattlesnakes, Peter said solemnly. A pony showed me how. Hannah felt a surge of love and pride so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Her children, her beautiful, resilient children, were trying to be brave for her sake, each offering the small skills they had acquired as proof they could face what came next. Then it's decided, she said, her voice steadier now. We'll ask Nahili for directions to Prescott, prepare as best we can, and leave when they do. The decision made, Hannah felt both relief and trepidation. They had a path forward now, uncertain though it might be. Whether it was the right one, only time would tell. The next morning, she approached Nahili as he worked on repairing a damaged arrow. We've decided to try for Prescott, she told him. When your family leaves for the winter camp, Nahili nodded, not seeming surprised by their decision. Good choice for children, he said, safer than other paths. He set aside his work and looked at her directly. 3 days to prepare. Much to learn still. Will you help us? Hannah asked, hating the neediness in her voice, but unable to suppress it. Show us the best route. What supplies to gather? Yes, Nahili said simply. We help. You not ready yet, but will be. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Every waking moment was devoted to preparation for the journey. Nahili took Samuel and occasionally Clara on longer expeditions, teaching them to recognize landmarks they would encounter on the route to Prescott, showing them how to find water sources that would be vital during the 5-day journey. Kiona worked with Hannah to prepare food that would travel well. Pemmican made from dried antelope meat mixed with animal fat and dried berries, hard biscuits from mesquite flour, small cakes of ground pine nuts that were surprisingly sustaining. They fashioned carrying pouches from the antelope hide Samuel had helped bring in, strips of yucca fiber serving as straps. Even Takoda contributed, carving small whistles from hollow reeds that each child could carry. For signals, he explained through Kiona's translation. If separated, 3 short blasts means danger, 2 long means safe. The thought of her children becoming separated from her was terrifying, but Hannah recognized the wisdom in preparing for all possibilities. The desert was unpredictable, and they would be traveling without the protection of numbers that the wagon train had provided. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Nahili spread a hide on the ground and used charcoal to draw a detailed map of the route to Prescott. He marked the locations of reliable water sources, areas to be avoided due to difficult terrain or potential dangers, and places where they might find shelter if needed. First day, reach this ridge, he said, pointing to his drawing. Good water there, hidden spring. Second day, through this valley. Be careful, rattlesnakes many. Third day, cross dry riverbed here. Look for cottonwood trees, where they grow. Water underground. Dig. Hannah committed every detail to memory, knowing their lives might depend on this information. Samuel crouched beside her, his young face intense with concentration as he did the same. 4th day hardest, Nahili continued. No water for long stretch. Travel at night if possible, cooler. His finger traced the route. 5th day, see smoke from town. Follow game trail down into valley. Prescott there. When he had finished, Hannah studied the map for a long time, fixing the route in her mind. Thank you, she said finally, looking up to meet Nahili's steady gaze. For everything. We wouldn't have survived without you and your family. Nahili's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Acceptance, perhaps, or approval. You learn quick, he said. Listen well. Most white people not listen to Apache. Most white people are fools, then, Hannah said with sudden fierceness. Your knowledge has saved my children's lives. I won't forget that. Nahili held her. Gazed for a moment longer, then nodded slightly. Remember desert lessons, He said not just how to find water, how to hunt. Remember patience. Remember to watch, to listen. Desert speaks. Those who hear, survive. That evening, as they shared what would be their last meal together, Hannah looked around at both families gathered by the fire. The divisions that had been so clear on that first day had blurred over time. Clara sat beside a pony, their heads bent together as they practiced a string game a pony had taught her. The twins were helping Kiona prepare a tea from desert herbs, following her instructions with careful attention. Peter was nestled against Takoda's side, listening to another of the old man's stories despite not understanding the words. And Samuel sat with Nahile, examining the bow the Apache man had gifted him that afternoon. It was larger than the practice bow he had been using, sized to grow with him as he matured. Nahile was showing him how to care for it properly, how to keep the sinew string dry and supple, how to check for cracks or weaknesses in the wood. These people were no longer strangers. They were teachers, guides, friends who had shared their knowledge and their home without expectation of repayment. In a world that had shown Hannah and her children such cruelty, they had offered kindness when it was most needed. As the fire burned lower and the children began to drift towards sleep, Hannah found herself wishing they could stay longer. Not forever. She knew their paths were destined to diverge, but long enough to learn everything these remarkable people could teach them. Long enough for the sharp pain of leaving to dull somewhat. But time was not a luxury they possessed. Tomorrow, both families would pack their meager belongings and set out on separate journeys. The Apache would head north into the mountains for their winter camp. Hannah and her children would turn east toward Prescott and whatever future awaited in them there. Hannah looked at Samuel, now sleeping peacefully beside the dying fire, the new bow carefully placed within reach of his hand. In the firelight, she could see traces of the man he would become, the strength in his jawline, the determination that sometimes flashed in his eyes. Jacob's son, carrying something of his father forward into a future neither of them had anticipated. They would make it to Prescott, Hannah decided. They would find work, shelter, a place to belong. And someday, perhaps, they would continue on to California as Jacob had planned. Not as the same people who had set out from St. Louis with dreams of fertile farmland, but as stronger, wiser travelers who understood the true cost and value of survival. As the last embers of the fire faded to ash, Hannah sent a silent prayer of gratitude into the darkness, not to any specific deity, but to the forces that had guided Nahile's family to find them in their hour of greatest need. Whatever happened next, that moment of mercy had changed them forever. The morning of departure arrived with a crimson sunrise that painted the desert in shades of fire. Hannah rose early, reluctant to waste even a moment of their final hours in the shelter that had become something like home. She found Nahile already, awake, sitting cross-legged at the cave entrance, watching the day begin with the stillness of a man accustomed to reading the world's subtle messages. "The sky speaks," he said without turning, aware of her presence nonetheless. "Good day for journey, no storms coming." Hannah settled beside him, drawing her shawl tighter against the pre-dawn chill. "I hope you're right, for both our paths." Nahile nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon where the mountains rose dark against the brightening sky. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence. Hannah had grown comfortable with these quiet moments, so different from the constant chatter and activity that had defined her previous life. "I need to ask you something," she said finally, "before we part ways." Nahile turned slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Ask." Hannah took a deep breath. "If we reach Prescott safely, if we find work there and a place to stay, could we send word to you somehow to let you know we're all right?" The question had been weighing on her for days. The thought of simply vanishing from these people's lives after all they had done felt wrong, like a story left unfinished. Naheli's expression remained unreadable, but Hannah thought she detected a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "White settlers rarely care what happens to Apache after paths cross," he observed. "We're not most white settlers," Hannah replied with quiet firmness. "Your family saved my children's lives. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Naheli considered. "This, no debt," he said after a moment. "Desert law, help those in need." "Even so," Hannah persisted, "is there a way? Some trader who passes between Prescott and your people? Someone who could carry a message?" Naheli was silent for so long that Hannah thought he might refuse. Then he reached into a small pouch at his belt and withdrew what appeared to be a polished stone, dark with flecks of turquoise running through it. He held it out to her. "Trader named Mackenzie," he said, as Hannah accepted the stone. "Comes to Prescott 3-4 times each year. Brings supplies, takes furs. He knows my mark." He pointed to a subtle etching on one side of the stone, a simplified hawk in flight. "Show him this. He will find me if he can." Hannah closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its smooth weight, a tangible connection to the man who had saved her family. "Thank you," she said simply. Naheli nodded once, then rose to his feet. "Time to prepare," he said. "Long journey for both our families today." The cave was soon bustling with activity as both families gathered their belongings. There wasn't much to pack. The Apache traveled light as a matter of necessity, and Hannah's family had only what they had been given or made during their stay. Still, every item now represented survival, carefully considered for its utility. Kiona approached, as Hannah was helping the twins arrange their small bundles. Without ceremony, she handed Hannah a tightly wrapped package of what appeared to be dried plants. "For sickness on journey," she explained. "This for fever." She pointed to different portions of the bundle. "This for stomach pain. This if snake bites." Hannah accepted the gift with profound gratitude. "How do I use them?" she asked, acutely aware of how much she still didn't know. Kiona spent the next several minutes explaining the preparation of each herb, which should be made into teas, which applied as poultices, which burned as smoke for breathing ailments. Hannah committed every word to memory, knowing their lives might depend on this knowledge. "Thank you," she said when Kiona had finished, "for teaching me, for being patient with our ignorance." A rare smile flickered across Kiona's face. "Women must know these things," she said, "to protect children, all women, not just Apache." Hannah nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared the fundamental responsibility of motherhood, keeping their children alive in a dangerous world. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Hannah's family would head east toward Prescott, while Naheli's would travel north into the mountains for their winter camp. The children made their goodbyes with a mixture of sadness and the remarkable resilience of youth. Clara exchanged small tokens with a pony, a braid of Clara's red hair for a beaded bracelet a pony had worn. The twins solemnly shook hands with Takoda, who had surprised everyone by carving tiny wooden animals for each of them. Peter clung briefly to a pony before Samuel gently pulled him away. Hannah approached Kiona one last time. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, but Kiona shook her head. "No thanks needed," she said firmly. "Remember what I taught. Teach your daughters. This is thanks enough." Hannah nodded, unexpectedly moved by the simplicity of the request. Knowledge passed from woman to woman, mother to daughter, across the boundaries of culture and language. It seemed right somehow. Finally, there was only Naheli. He stood slightly apart, checking the contents of his pack one last time. Hannah hesitated, uncertain of the proper way to bid farewell to this man, who had become so central to their survival. Samuel solved the dilemma by approaching Nahele directly. He stood straight, meeting the Apache man's gaze with newfound confidence. "Thank you for teaching me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Hannah could hear beneath it. "I won't forget what you showed me." Nahele studied the boy for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder, the first time Hannah had seen him initiate physical contact with any of them. "You have good eyes," he said. "Good hands. Remember, patience. In hunting, patience in life. Watch before acting. Listen before speaking." Samuel nodded solemnly, clearly treasuring these final words of wisdom. Nahele turned to Hannah then. "5 days to Prescott if all goes well," he reminded her. "Follow map in your mind. Travel early. Morning, late afternoon, rest during heat of day." "We will," Hannah promised, "and we'll be careful." Nahele held her gaze for a long moment. "You are stronger than you know," he said finally. "Desert shows true strength. You have it." Before Hannah could respond, he turned away, signaling to his family that it was time to depart. Hannah watched as they gathered their few possessions and moved with practiced efficiency toward the mouth of the cave. At the entrance, Nahele paused, looking back one final time. "May your path be clear," he said, the formal words carrying the weight of a blessing. Then they were gone, descending the rocky slope with the sureness of those born to this harsh land. Hannah stood watching until they disappeared among the boulders, a curious emptiness opening within her chest. Samuel came to stand beside her. "We should go too, Mama," he said gently, "while the morning is still cool." Hannah nodded, turning back to her other children who waited with unusual patience, understanding the significance of this moment. "Yes," she agreed, "it's time." They left the cave that had sheltered them, each carrying their share of the supplies Nahele's family had helped them prepare. Hannah led the way, following the mental map Nahele had etched into her mind. East toward Prescott, toward an uncertain future, but one they would face together. The first day's journey was harder than Hannah had anticipated. Though they had regained much of their strength during their time with the Apache, they were still not accustomed to long hours of walking across difficult terrain. The children tired quickly, especially Peter, whose small legs struggled to maintain the pace Hannah knew they needed to keep. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. Following Nahele's advice, Hannah called a halt in the shade of a large rock formation. They sipped sparingly from their water skins and ate a small portion of the journey bread Kiona had helped them prepare. "How much farther today, Mama?" Clara asked, her face flushed with exertion. Hannah consulted her mental. "Nahele said we should reach a ridge with a hidden spring by evening. That's our goal for today." Samuel, who had been scanning their surroundings with the careful attention Nahele had taught him, pointed to a distant rise. "I think that might be it," he said. "See how the rocks change color there?" Nahele said to look for reddish stone. Hannah squinted against the glare. Samuel's eyesight was keener than hers, but she could just make out the feature he was indicating. "Good spotting," she praised. "That does look like what he described." They rested until the worst of the day's heat had passed, then continued their journey. The terrain grew increasingly rocky as they approached the ridge, making progress slower. Hannah kept a vigilant eye on the twins, who had a tendency to race ahead, despite her warnings about conserving energy. Peter had claimed a perch on Samuel's back, his small arms wrapped trustingly around his brother's neck. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they finally reached the base of the ridge. Now came the challenge of finding the hidden spring Nahele had described. Samuel set Peter down and began examining the rock face methodically, looking for the signs they had been taught, certain types of vegetation, patterns of moisture, the presence of small animals. "Here, Mama," Clara called suddenly. She was standing near a narrow fissure in the rock, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. "There's something growing inside." Hannah joined her daughter, peering into the shadowy crevice. Sure enough, a small patch of green vegetation clung to the inner wall, the unmistakable sign of water. "Samuel," she called, "bring the water skins. I think Clara's found it." The space was too narrow for an adult to navigate comfortably, but Clara, slight for her 10 years, was able to slip through with relative ease. Hannah passed her an empty water skin, and they all waited anxiously until Clara's voice echoed back to them. "It's here, just like Naheli said. A little pool of water coming right out of the rock." Relief washed over Hannah. Their first test had been passed. They had found the water that would sustain them through the next day's journey. They made camp in the shelter of the ridge, using the small fire pit left by previous travelers, perhaps Nahele himself on earlier journeys. As darkness fell, Hannah looked back over the distance they had covered. The mountains where the cave lay were now shadowy forms on the horizon. They had made good progress, but the journey had only begun. That night, as the children slept bundled in their blankets under a vast canopy of stars, Hannah remained awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night. Somewhere, a coyote called, its lonely howl echoing across the empty landscape. Insects hummed, their chorus rising and falling like breath. The wind whispered among the rocks, carrying secrets from distant places. She found herself wondering about Naheli's family. Had they reached their intended campsite for the night? Were they also sitting beneath these same stars, perhaps thinking of the strange white family they had rescued and taught? Hannah's hand closed around the stone Nahele had given her, its smooth surface cool against her palm. A connection, however tenuous, to people who had become unexpectedly important to her. People who had shown her that kindness could transcend the boundaries humans so often placed between themselves. The next morning brought new challenges. They had refilled their water skins at the spring, but the day promised to be even hotter than the previous one. According to Nahele's directions, they would need to traverse a valley notorious for rattlesnakes before reaching their next water source. Hannah gathered the children before setting out, her expression serious. "Today, we must be especially careful," she told them. "Watch where you step, listen for warnings, stay close together." They nodded, even the twins unusually solemn. The encounter with the wolf during their desperate journey to the cave had taught them all that danger could appear suddenly in this unforgiving land. They set out just as dawn broke, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before the heat became unbearable. Hannah led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the path ahead for the diamond patterns of snakeskin against the earth. Samuel brought up the rear, his new bow ready in case they encountered threats that couldn't be avoided. The valley was eerily beautiful. Rock formations in fantastic shapes rose on either side, sculpted by wind and rare but violent rains over countless centuries. Under different circumstances, Hannah might have paused to appreciate the stark landscape. Now, she focused only on moving her family safely through it. Midway through the morning, they had their first rattlesnake encounter. Hannah froze at the distinctive sound, instantly recognizing the warning from Nahele's descriptions. She threw out an arm to halt Clara behind her. "Nobody move," she said quietly but firmly. The rattler was coiled a few yards ahead, its warning clear, but not yet at the fever pitch that would precede a strike. Slowly, Hannah reached for the walking stick Takoda had carved for her. With careful movements, she extended it toward the snake, ready to deflect an attack if necessary. "Back up," she instructed her children, very slowly, no sudden movements. They obeyed with remarkable discipline, even the youngest understanding the gravity of the situation. Hannah maintained eye contact with the rattler, slowly retreating until they were well beyond its strike range. "Now we go around," she said, pointing to a path that would give the snake's territory a wide berth. "Remember what Nahele taught us. We are visitors in their home. We respect their warnings. Samuel nodded approvingly. Nahali said snakes don't want to fight us. They just want us to go away. Exactly, Hannah agreed, and that's what we'll do. They encountered 2 more rattlesnakes before midday, handling each encounter with increasing confidence. By the time they stopped to rest in the shade of a large boulder, Hannah felt a surprising sense of accomplishment. They were applying what they had learned, adapting to the desert's challenges. As they shared a small meal of dried meat and piñon nuts, Clara studied the distant mountains thoughtfully. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" she asked. "Nahali's family?" Hannah considered her answer carefully. "I don't know," she admitted. "Their lives are very different from ours, but I hope so." "Nahali gave Mama a special stone," Samuel added, "to send messages through a trader who knows him." The twins perked up at this news. "Really? Can we see it?" Abigail asked eagerly. Hannah hesitated, then withdrew the polished stone from her pocket. The children gathered around, admiring its smooth surface and the subtle hawk etching. "It's beautiful," Clara murmured. "Why would he give you something so special, Mama?" Hannah felt warmth rise to her cheeks, unsure why the innocent question caused such a reaction. "So, we can let them know we reached Prescott safely," she explained, tucking the stone away again. "It's a kindness, that's all." But as they resumed their journey, Hannah found herself pondering Clara's question. Why had Nahali given her the stone? Was it merely practical, a way to identify themselves to the trader, or was there something more to the gesture? She recalled the intensity in his dark eyes when he had placed it in her palm, the brief moment when their fingers had touched. "Stop it," she chided herself. "You're a widow with 5 children, focused on survival. There's no room for such thoughts." Yet the memory persisted as they made their way through the valley, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. By late afternoon, they had cleared the snake-infested territory and begun the climb toward the ridge where they would camp for the night. The going was steeper here, the path less obvious. Hannah found herself wishing for Nahali's sure guidance, his intimate knowledge of the terrain. Samuel, as if sensing her uncertainty, moved to the front of their small group. "I think we need to head that way," he said, pointing toward a gap between 2 rocky outcroppings. "See how the ground looks worn? Other people have gone that way." Hannah studied the area he indicated and saw he was right. There was a faint trail, visible only to eyes trained to look for such subtle signs. Pride swelled in her chest. "Good spotting," she said. "Lead on." Samuel straightened visibly at the responsibility, adjusting his pack and bow before setting off toward the gap. The others followed, Peter now holding Clara's hand while the twins stayed close to Hannah. The path grew steeper, requiring them to use hands as well as feet in some places. Hannah worried about Peter, but the small boy tackled the climb with surprising determination, accepting help only when absolutely necessary. "I can do it myself," he insisted when Hannah reached to lift him over a particularly difficult section. "Nahali says boys must be strong." Hannah bit back a smile. "He does indeed, but even strong boys accept help sometimes." Peter considered this, then nodded solemnly. "All right, but just this once." By sunset, they had reached the ridgetop where a natural depression in the rock offered shelter from the wind. There was no water here. They would have to rely on what they carried until reaching the dry riverbed tomorrow, but the location provided a good vantage point to watch for potential dangers. As they settled in for the night, Hannah took stock of their situation. They had covered approximately 2/5 of the journey to Prescott, according to Nahali's map. They had water enough for another day if they were careful. The children were tired, but not exhausted, handling the challenges better than she had dared hope. They might actually make it, she realized with a sudden rush of emotion. Not just survive, but truly begin again. Samuel joined her at the edge of their camp. where she sat looking out over the darkening landscape. "You should rest, Mama," he said. "I'll take first watch." Hannah studied her son in the fading light. When had he grown so capable, so responsible? The boy who had left St. Louis, still visible in his features, but now overlaid with something new, a confidence, a purpose that had been forged in the crucible of their ordeal. "We'll both watch for a while," she decided. "Then I'll sleep and you can wake me for the second half of the night." Samuel nodded, settling beside her with his bow across his knees. For a time, they sat in companionable silence, watching as stars emerged in the vast desert sky. "Do you think Pa would be proud?" Samuel asked suddenly, his voice small in the darkness. "Of how we're doing?" Hannah's throat tightened with emotion. "Oh, Samuel," she said softly. "He would be so very proud, especially of you." Samuel ducked his head, but not before Hannah caught the gleam of tears in his eyes. "I miss him," he admitted, "but sometimes I forget what his voice sounded like. Is that terrible?" Hannah put an arm around his shoulders, pulling him against her side, as she hadn't been able to do since the massacre, her strong, brave son, who had been trying so hard to be the man of the family. "No," she assured him, "it's not terrible. It's just how our minds work when we lose someone. But you'll never forget him, Samuel. He's part of you." Samuel leaned into her embrace for a moment before straightening again, as if remembering his self-appointed role as protector. "Nahele said something to me," he confided, "before we left, when you were helping the twins with their packs." "What did he say?" Hannah prompted when Samuel fell silent. "He said that a boy becomes a man not when he's no longer afraid, but when he acts with courage despite his fear." Samuel's voice held wonder at the concept. "He said he saw that in me when I went hunting with him, that I was afraid, but I did what needed to be done anyway." Hannah swallowed against the lump in her throat. "Nahele is a wise man," she said, "and he's right about you." Samuel seemed to grow taller at her words. "I've been thinking about what he taught me," he continued. "Not just the hunting and tracking, but the other things. About listening before speaking, about being patient." He glanced at her. "I think those are things Pa would have wanted me to learn too." "Yes," Hannah agreed softly. "Your father valued those qualities greatly." She thought of Jacob, his quiet strength, his thoughtful approach to life. "You're becoming very much like him in the ways that matter most." They lapsed into silence. Again, each lost in private thoughts as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Hannah sent Samuel to sleep, promising to wake him for his turn at watch later. Alone, beneath the star-strewn sky, Hannah found her thoughts turning once more to Nahele. What had he seen in her family that prompted such generosity? What had moved him to share his knowledge, his food, his shelter with strangers who, under different circumstances, might have been enemies? She recalled something he had said during one of their quiet conversations by the cave fire. "There was a time I hated all white faces. After soldiers came to our village. After I found my first wife, my children." He hadn't finished the sentence, but he hadn't needed to. The grief in his eyes had told her everything, the same grief she had seen reflected in her own mirror after Jacob's death. Loss that cut so deep it changed who you were, how you saw the world. Yet somehow Nahele had moved beyond hatred, had found the capacity to judge each person by their actions rather than the color of their skin or the language they spoke, had taught his son and daughter to do the same. It was a rare quality in this frontier land where suspicion and violence were the common currency between different peoples. Hannah wondered what it had cost him to overcome his bitterness, to reach out to her family when they were at their most vulnerable. As the night hours passed, Hannah kept vigilant watch over her sleeping children. The desert was alive with sounds, the occasional howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the sparse vegetation, the whisper of wind among the rocks. She had feared these sounds once. Now she listened to them with growing understanding, learning to distinguish between the ordinary noises of desert night and anything that might signal danger. When the moon reached its zenith, Hannah gently woke Samuel for his watch. He came alert immediately, reaching for his bow before fully awake, another lesson from Nahele that had become instinct. "All quiet?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "All quiet," Hannah confirmed. "Wake me if anything changes." She settled into her blankets, body aching from the day's journey, but mind strangely peaceful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The dry riverbed crossing, the search for the cottonwood trees that would signal underground water. But for now, in this moment, her children were safe. They were applying what they had learned. They were finding their way. As sleep began to claim her, Hannah's fingers closed once more around the stone in her pocket. A connection to the man who had changed their fate with a single act of mercy. A reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, humanity's capacity for compassion could flourish. Perhaps that was Nahele's most important lesson, one not spoken aloud but demonstrated through his actions. In a world where cruelty and kindness existed side by side, the choice between them defined not just survival, but what kind of survival was worth fighting for. With that thought, Hannah drifted into dreamless sleep beneath the desert stars. Her children gathered close around her like a constellation of their own. Dawn arrived on the fourth day with an ominous stillness. Hannah sensed the change before she opened her eyes. The air felt different, heavy, with an unfamiliar tension. She rose quickly, scanning the horizon where a faint haze obscured the distant mountains. "Samuel," she called softly, rousing her son who had fallen asleep during the final hours of his watch. "Look there." Samuel blinked awake, following her gesture toward the southern sky. His expression grew serious. "Dust," he said. "Nahele warned about this. Dust storms come quickly in the dry season." Hannah nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. This was the day Nahele had described as most difficult, a long stretch without water. If a dust storm forced them to seek shelter, they might not reach the next water source before their supplies ran dangerously low. "We need to move," she decided. "Now, before it gets closer." They roused the other children, packed their meager belongings with practiced efficiency, and set out as the sun breached the eastern horizon. Hannah set a brisk pace, keeping anxious watch on the southern sky, where the haze was slowly darkening. "What happens if the storm catches us?" Clara asked, sensing her mother's concern. "We'll need to find shelter," Hannah explained. "Cover our faces with wet cloth to breathe. Wait it out." "But our water," Clara began. "We'll manage," Hannah interrupted, unwilling to voice her deeper fears in front of the younger children. "Nahele taught us what to do." They pressed on through increasingly difficult terrain, a labyrinth of dry washes and crumbling rock formations that slowed their progress despite their urgency. By mid-morning, the distant haze had become an unmistakable wall of dust, moving steadily northward, directly into their path. "There," Samuel said suddenly, pointing to a cluster of large boulders on a nearby rise. "We could shelter there until it passes." Hannah hesitated. Taking shelter meant using precious hours of daylight, perhaps forcing them to travel during the hottest part of the day. But continuing risked being caught in the open when the storm hit. She thought of Nahele's steady voice. "Desert speaks. Those who hear survive." "Yes," she decided. "We'll shelter there, quickly now." They reached the boulders just as the wind began to strengthen, carrying the first tendrils of dust. Hannah directed the children into a natural hollow between two massive rocks where they would be protected from the worst of the storm. "Wet. Your bandanas," she instructed, dispensing precious water from her skin. "Cover your mouth and nose, like Kiona showed us." As the storm engulfed them, the world disappeared into a swirling maelstrom of dust and wind. The children huddled together, eyes tightly closed, breathing through dampened cloth. Hannah positioned herself at the outer edge of their shelter, her body providing an additional barrier between her children and the raging elements. Time lost meaning in the howling darkness. Hannah found herself thinking of the wagon train, of the families who had perished in the massacre. Would they too have survived this journey if fate had granted them the chance? Would they have learned to read the desert's warnings, to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, to navigate by landmarks invisible to untrained eyes? Gradually, the fury of the storm began to subside. The howling diminished to a whisper, then to silence. Hannah cautiously lifted her bandana and peered out. The landscape had been transformed, familiar features altered or obscured by drifts of dust and sand. She felt a moment of panic. How would they find their way now? Samuel joined her, his young face etched with the same concern. "The landmarks Nahali described," he said quietly. "Some of them might be covered." Hannah nodded, forcing calm into her voice. "Then we'll use the sun. Nahali taught us that too." She pointed eastward. "Prescott still lies that way. We keep the sun on our right in the morning, at our backs. In the afternoon, mush." They emerged from their shelter to find a changed world. The storm had scoured the land, revealing rock formations previously hidden while burying others. Their water supplies, already limited, had been further depleted, dampening the bandanas. "We need to find the cottonwood trees," Hannah reminded them, "the dry riverbed where we can dig for water." They set out again, moving more slowly now, each of them scanning the horizon for the vital landmark. The sun climbed higher, bringing punishing heat that seemed to drain their energy with every step. Peter began to lag behind, his small legs struggling with the pace. Samuel wordlessly lifted his brother onto his back, continuing without complaint, despite his additional burden. By midday, Hannah's heart was sinking. They should have reached the riverbed by now, according to Nahali's directions. Had they veered off course during the storm? Were they now walking parallel to their intended path, missing crucial landmarks? Clara stumbled, catching herself before falling. "I'm thirsty, Mama," she admitted, her voice raspy from the dust. Hannah checked their water supplies with growing alarm. Less than a third remained in the main skin, with smaller amounts in the children's personal containers. Not enough to last until Prescott, if they couldn't find the cottonwood trees. "We'll rest," she decided, "conserve our strength during the worst heat." They found meager shade beneath an overhanging rock and settled there, each receiving a carefully measured sip of water. Hannah fought back desperation. What would Nahali do? In this situation, how would he read this featureless landscape? Samuel sat apart from the others, his face turned toward the eastern horizon. After a long silence, he spoke. "I think I see something," he said, his voice uncertain. A different color far ahead. Hannah joined him, straining her eyes against the glare. At first, she saw nothing but shimmering heat waves and endless tan earth. Then gradually, she made out what Samuel had spotted, a faint line of green, barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. "Trees," she breathed. "It could be the cottonwoods." Hope renewed their strength. As soon as the worst heat began to wane, they set out toward the distant green smudge. The journey seemed endless, the trees appearing to recede even as they approached. But finally, unmistakably, the gnarled shapes of cottonwood trees emerged from the haze, a ragged line marking the course of the dry riverbed Nahali had described. "We found it," Clara exclaimed, her voice cracking with relief. "Just like Nahali said." They reached the riverbed as the sun was beginning its descent. Though no water flowed on the surface, the presence of the trees confirmed what Nahali had taught them. Water existed underground here, accessible to the trees' deep roots and, hopefully, to determined humans. Samuel immediately began clearing sand from the lowest point of the riverbed, remembering Nahele's instructions. The twins joined him, using sticks to dig down toward the moisture they desperately needed. Hannah watched anxiously, acutely aware of their dwindling supplies and the distance still remaining to Prescott. "Look!" Abigail cried suddenly. "The sand is darker here!" Samuel dug more frantically, and within moments, their efforts were rewarded. Water began to seep into the hole they had created, muddy at first, but clearing as they watched. By the time darkness fell, they had refilled all their water skins and drunk their fill for the first time since leaving the cave. That night, as they camped beneath the cottonwood trees, Hannah felt a profound shift within herself. They had faced a serious challenge, the kind that had claimed countless lives on the frontier, and overcome it using knowledge freely given by people who could have been enemies but had chosen to be teachers instead. "We're going to make it to Prescott," she told her children as they gathered around the small fire. "And when we do, we'll find a way to build a new life." "Will we still go to California someday?" Clara asked, the question carrying the weight of Jacob's unfulfilled dream. Hannah considered this carefully. "Perhaps," she said, "but first we need to establish ourselves in Prescott, learn more about surviving in this land, become stronger." Samuel nodded his agreement. "Nahele said rushing into country you don't understand is foolish. Better to learn slowly, build knowledge." "Wise words," Hannah acknowledged. "Your father would have said the same, I think, had he known what we know now." The conversation drifted to speculation about Prescott, what they might find there, what work Hannah might seek, how they would establish themselves in the frontier town. For the first time since the massacre, the children spoke of the future with genuine hope rather than fear or resignation. Later, when the younger ones had drifted to sleep, Samuel remained awake, keeping watch with his bow beside him. Hannah joined him, drawing her blanket around her shoulders against the desert night's chill. "You've become quite the hunter," she observed. "Nahele taught you well." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "He taught me more than hunting," he said. "He showed me that being a man isn't about fighting or dominating. It's about protecting what matters, respecting what sustains life." He glanced at his sleeping siblings. "I understand Pa better now, I think." Hannah's heart swelled with emotion. "Your father would be so proud of the young man you're becoming," she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire casting dancing shadows across the sand. Hannah's fingers found the stone in her pocket, its smooth surface now familiar to her touch, a connection to the man who had saved them, who had seen value in teaching rather than fearing those different from himself. "We'll find that trader in Prescott," she decided aloud. "Send word to Nahele that we reached safety." Samuel nodded. "I'd like that. To let him know his teachings helped us survive." The journey's final day dawned clear and promising. According to Nahele's directions, they should reach Prescott by nightfall if they maintained a steady pace. The knowledge of civilization ahead gave new energy to their steps, despite the accumulated fatigue of days on the trail. By mid-afternoon, they spotted the first sign of human presence, a crude fence line marking a ranch's boundary. Shortly after, they encountered an actual road, rutted wagon tracks leading toward their destination. The sight of these simple markers of civilization brought unexpected tears to Hannah's eyes. They followed the road as shadows lengthened across the land. Finally, as the sun touched the western horizon, they crested a small rise. And there it was, Prescott, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk. Hannah gathered her children around her, taking a moment to absorb the significance of what they had accomplished. "We made it," she said simply, "because of what we learned, because we didn't give up." Clara slipped her hand into Hannah's. "Because the Apache family helped us when no one else would. she added softly. Yes, Hannah agreed, and we won't forget that. As they descended toward the town, Hannah felt a curious mixture of emotions: relief at reaching safety, apprehension about the reception they might receive, sadness at the final separation from Nahele's family, and underneath it all, a newfound confidence in her own ability to lead her children through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had crossed the desert. They had learned its harsh lessons. They had found strength they never knew they possessed. Whatever awaited them in Prescott and beyond, they would face it together, carrying with them the knowledge and wisdom freely shared by those who had once been strangers but had become, in the crucible of survival, something like family. Hannah's hand closed once more around the stone in her pocket as they took their first steps toward their new beginning. Some debts could never be repaid, but they could be honored in how one lived, what one taught, the stories one passed down. And in that, perhaps, lay the truest measure of survival. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.